I'm a single man in my early 30s. I have a 29-year-old brother who already has 4 kids. He had his first at 22, the second a year later, the third 2 years after that, and the fourth was born a couple of months ago. His wife, my sister-in-law, and I don't get along. She always tries to act superior and becomes an extreme self-victimizing drama queen if I retaliate. She can cry instantly and put on a very convincing show to get sympathy. My parents and brother adore her, even though they know her true nature. She's good-looking, but has a terrible personality. She refuses to get a job despite having a college degree, and my mother helps with the kids all day. Their finances depend entirely on my brother, so they live in my parents' house. Privacy is an issue in the 3-bedroom 60s built house. Growing up, my younger brother was the favorite. We're 3 years apart. He developed a superiority complex because I was severely punished if I fought back against his pranks. It was clear my parents cared more for him, as he got most things. Our family members sometimes pointed this out, which led my parents to move us 150 miles away. We only saw them on holidays as it was a 3-hour drive. My brother was physically abusive to me, flirted with my first girlfriend until she broke up with me, and laughed at my misfortunes. My parents told me to endure it. I only got equal treatment when they wanted to save face. It was funny to see them treat me equally on birthdays and Christmas when others were around. We had nosy relatives who loved drama, so my parents hid the truth and threatened to take my stuff if I didn't stay quiet. When I turned 18 and moved out before graduating high school, they were relieved as they no longer had to support me. I had low contact with them after leaving. They didn't even attend my high school graduation, but I didn't care. I only saw them on holidays like the rest of the family. The 2020 pandemic hit me hard. I lost my job and couldn't renew my condo lease as my roommate also lost his job and we couldn't afford it on unemployment. I loved the rented 2-bedroom condo. As the lease ended, my roommate left early to stay with relatives, and I had to sell most of my stuff to avoid homelessness. I shouldn't have rented such an expensive place. I bought a $1,000 camper for my truck to live in temporarily, but it lasted much longer. I hoped to park it at my parents' house where my brother and his family lived, but they refused, saying they had a full house and wanted me to pay a high fee, almost like apartment rent. I was jobless and trying to save. My parents called the camper an eyesore and told me to leave. My sister-in-law found it hilarious that I had to live in a camper, and my brother joined her in mocking me, calling me a homeless bum. I parked my truck/camper in a store parking lot on the first night with nowhere else to go. I was terrified of a break-in and didn't sleep well. I couldn't go to other relatives as they were far away, and my friends lived in apartments. I was attached to the area and didn't want to leave. I had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment. Finding a stable parking spot was tough. I searched for a job similar to my old one for months while living the nomadic camper life. I faced many issues, from beggars and drug addicts to people asking me to leave because of the camper. Someone claiming to be from an HOA asked me to move, even though I wasn't on a residential street. When I questioned, they got aggressive and threatened me. I moved to avoid trouble. To have electricity, I used a long extension cord to plug into random building outlets while parked on the street. It was a bad thing to do, but I needed to keep my camper batteries charged for the fridge. I had a small solar power bank for my phone, but no generator. Generators are noisy and need fuel. After months, I finally got a new job and moved to the neighboring city. I didn't want a retail job as I had done it in college. I was still getting unemployment, but had no stable home. I was bored and had few activities like reading, watching movies on a portable DVD player, using my phone or laptop, and noting parking and bathroom locations. When I got the new job, I lived in the back lot of the building by the warehouse and old employee parking spaces that no one used. My boss liked this as I was available for any shift. He let me set up my camper in one of the spaces so I could drive without it. I'm not sure if it was legal, but no one complained. I had few trespassers, and the security guards escorted them out. I was on call almost all the time and worked nearly every day. My boss let me plug into the building for power and water, and I paid a small rent by working for free on Sundays. I usually showered at a friend's apartment or the gym, as the camper had only a portable toilet. I didn't want to fill it, as emptying it was a nasty job. I had a key to the warehouse to use the bathroom. I became good friends with the night security guard. The camper was easy to heat in winter with a small electric heater, but summers were tough without AC. I got to use portable air conditioner. I made a lot of overtime pay and learned new skills. Mid-year, I got a better position as a supervisor and a better salary. Then I decided to buy a house. Losing my condo made me realize I needed stability. I found a 3-bedroom manufactured home 2 miles from work and got it for $10,000 less than the asking price. I used most of my savings for a down payment and got a home loan. I finally had a proper home and set up the camper in the backyard. When I settled in, I foolishly bragged about it on Facebook. My family saw the post and showed up unannounced to tour my home. I don't know how they found my address. Once I opened the door, they pushed their way in like rowdy tourists and made themselves at home. My sister-in-law had a creepy smirk. My parents talked about how I had too much space for a single person. My brother said the house was closer to his job and had more space than our parents' house did. Eventually, my brother asked to talk privately. Everyone else left the room and went to the front porch. He said the house was too much for me and I should let him move in with his family as his wife was pregnant with their fourth child. He said I could live in the camper outside. He never mentioned rent, even though he has a good job. He also talked about changes in curfews and said I couldn't enter without notice. I tried to speak, but he kept talking over me. There was no way I'd let him move in. I might rent to others to pay the mortgage, but not him or his wife. I've seen similar situations online and never thought it would happen to me. But my family fit the description of narcissistic and entitled. I started recording on my phone. My brother didn't notice and continued talking about why he needed the house and acted like it was a done deal, trying to shake my hand. I said, "Hell no," loudly, and he stumbled back. I rarely raised my voice like that before as I was punished, but this was my house. I told him it wasn't up for grabs and that I bought it for myself. He got close to me and said I didn't deserve it and he needed a better place for his family. I laughed and said I worked hard for it. He yelled that I had no wife or kids and didn't need the space, so I should give it to him. I said I wouldn't and that he never offered rent. If he moved in, I'd still pay the mortgage and couldn't live in my own house. He said he shouldn't have to pay rent as his family came first and that our parents said I would let him move in. I yelled that their word wasn't law and they couldn't give my house to him. Then my parents and sister-in-law came back in and tried to force me to agree. There was a big fight. I heard just do it for damn many times. I told them they had no say in my life or house and to leave or I'd call the cops. My sister-in-law screamed that she was pregnant and I couldn't do this to her. I said I did nothing and she couldn't just take from me. I called her a stuck-up bitch. She got angry and hit me in the face. My brother held her back as she tried to scratch my eyes out. I held up my phone and said I'd call the police if they didn't leave. My parents said they were leaving and my mother said I had a week to change my mind. I told her I wouldn't and not to come back. I told my sister-in-law my phone recorded everything and if she tried anything, I'd press charges. She screamed and left crying. My mother said I should do it for Dan and his wife. I said I wouldn't. As I mentioned in the initial part of my story, many will find this account both hard to believe and rather lengthy. I'm aware that there are similar tales floating around on the internet. I've come across quite a few of them. However, just because others have shared similar experiences doesn't mean they have the monopoly on such situations. In fact, I'm rather astonished that this platform hasn't been more effectively utilized to combat such entitlement, as those who act this way should be more fearful of being publicly exposed here. Anyway, I don't hold it against anyone who doubts the authenticity of my story. I would likely do the same if I were in their shoes. But by reading this in my previous post, you'll understand just how dysfunctional my parents are. They have been the root cause of all the chaos in my life, spoiling my brother to the point where he has become the self-centered person he is today. And they have never provided a legitimate reason for their behavior. I'm even a bit afraid that there might not be one. Some people simply can't explain their choices, like showing favoritism among children. All they can do is stand by the child they have chosen to support. That's precisely what my parents have been attempting. And as a result, I have, in a sense, emotionally shattered their lives. After I forcefully ejected my parents, brother, and sister-in-law when they tried to coerce me into surrendering my new house to my brother, I immediately took to social media and recounted the entire incident to the entire family. The story spread rapidly, although it can't be found now as it was deleted some time ago, and I made my profile private. I shared it because I knew that the first thing my family would do upon returning home was to distort the events and paint me as the villain. And I was right, but I had a head start of about an hour. Moreover, I had video evidence to substantiate my version of what had transpired. I have no intention of sharing the video here, so please don't ask. My preemptive action was successful as a significant number of family members sided with me right away. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law must have been all set to post their own version, but it was too late. So they didn't even bother fabricating elaborate lies. My parents, Dan, and my sister-in-law had a few supporters, but not many. Plenty of others were well aware of how entitled they were. So the situation was quickly understood and accepted by most. There was one particular individual who called me. I don't know who it was, but they ran it at me, claiming that I was a dreadful brother and that I should make way for a real family man. I simply ended the call and blocked the number. This didn't happen again. A week passed, and just as they had threatened in their previous ultimatum, my parents showed up at my front porch with Dan. They rang the doorbell incessantly and pounded on the door until I finally opened it. I opened it only a sliver, and they attempted to barge in once more. However, I had installed a couple of latch chains that prevented their entry, and I even braced myself against the door for added security. My father and brother demanded that I let them in, but I informed them that I was recording everything and that I would call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother managed to calm them down, and then, in an overly sweet tone, asked me if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest of them to get lost and never return. My mother feigned tears and asked me why I couldn't do this for Dan, as he was my beloved brother. I laughed and bluntly stated that I didn't consider him a brother I could love, given how he had treated me poorly for years, and they had only encouraged his behavior. They were terrible parents, and he was a lousy brother. I then told them to leave, or I would call the police immediately. They left surprisingly easily, aside from my mother's loud sobbing and the others giving me dirty looks. One could say that getting them to leave was almost too easy. I thought the whole fiasco was over, but I should have taken them more seriously, as they had other idiotic plans. Later that week, on Friday evening, I returned home to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. It was Dan and his family, in the process of moving their stuff in. He greeted me with a smug grin and a wave. I was enraged and ordered him and his family to stop, but my sister-in-law smugly informed me that whether I liked it or not, they were moving in. Then, in an extremely fake manner, tilting her head and puckering her lips, she said it was okay because my mommy allowed it, and that I should always listen to what my mommy told me. Hearing those words and seeing her self-satisfied, bitchy face made my blood boil. So I locked myself in my truck and immediately called the cops. When they realized what I was doing, my sister-in-law started pounding on my window and yelling at me to stop, claiming that she and Dan needed the house and crying, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I retorted, "Fuck Dan. It's my damn house, not his." She then threatened to scratch the side of my truck unless I stopped calling the police. The 911 operator overheard everything due to the slightly open window. I warned my sister-in-law that if she damaged my truck, I would sue her. She was smart enough to back off. When the police arrived, Dan and my sister-in-law, along with their kids, had locked themselves inside my house. I informed the cops about what had happened and showed them my new driver's license with my current address. When we approached my front door, I noticed that they had changed the lock. The old lock was lying on the porch with the center drilled out, and the drill, along with a complete Harbor Freight drill bit set, was right beside it. Could they have been any more foolish to leave such blatant evidence? I pointed out the broken lock and drill and gave the police a detailed account of all the previous events. I suspect that Dan called our parents after I arrived home, because they showed up while I was speaking to the cops. My parents immediately lied and claimed that I had agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I countered that this was an easily disproven lie. So Dan and my sister-in-law finally emerged from my house, holding some papers. They both looked extremely smug, as if they had outwitted me. They had actually drawn up and printed a fake rental agreement. But my signature was nowhere to be found. There was a signature, but it bore no resemblance to my handwriting. I don't think any of them had ever seen my actual signature. It was an incredibly stupid move on their part. I informed my parents and Dan that this was blatant fraud. If the cops investigated, they would quickly uncover it. And I didn't think going to jail and court would be beneficial for them. It could even cost Dan his job, which is his family's sole source of income. I also stated that I would hire a lawyer and sue for damages if any of my belongings were lost, stolen, or damaged. And I would call CPS for good measure. Dan turned pale and looked terrified when I said all that. But my mother stepped in between us and persisted, saying that I should do this for Dan and live in the camper so they could have a proper family home. I yelled at her that if she thought it was such a great idea, she could do it for Dan herself and let Dan have her house. The cops separated my mother from me, and I demanded that they all leave immediately or I would press charges. I shouted about how they had drilled out my front door lock to break in. The lease papers were obvious fakes. They had forged my signature poorly, and I had recorded video of my sister-in-law attacking me. These were serious felonies that could ruin their lives if I chose to pursue them. And if they didn't leave, that's exactly what I would do. The only reason I hadn't already was for the sake of Dan's children. So they had one chance to get out, The moment my parents heard that, I think they finally realized they couldn't force me to do this for Dan. My mother relented and said she would put an end to this. She then went over to my sister-in-law and spoke to her quietly for a minute while my father talked to Dan. My sister-in-law immediately burst into loud tears and tore up the fake rental papers into tiny pieces, scattering them like confetti. An officer then told them to pick up the pieces or he would cite them for littering. Both cops had the look of, "I don't get paid enough for this," on their faces. Dan had to tell his kids to load their stuff back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying, and the eldest was sobbing that he wouldn't get his own room now. My sister-in-law and Dan gathered the kids together to make one last pitiful attempt to make me feel guilty with a sad family act. Where they all huddled together in a group hug, facing the same direction. I swear, it seemed like they had practiced it beforehand. All the kids had the same pleading look with trembling lips. My sister-in-law kept rubbing her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy, and my brother made the saddest face he could and said, "Please don't do this. We need to be able to live here." But I didn't waver and told them to keep packing. The kids and my sister-in-law intensified their crying, and Dan yelled at me, "Are you happy with yourself? You've denied us a home because you're too selfish to share and help out family." I laughed maniacally and retorted that what he was trying to do was take, not share. And no amount of crying would make me let his family move in because he was no longer a brother to me. He was just an entitled jerk who thought he could take whatever he wanted from me like he did when we were kids. Dan started swearing at me until the cops told him to calm down or he would be arrested regardless of whether I wanted to press charges. He pursed his lips and looked a combination of scared and extremely angry. I asked the cops if they could stay until my parents, brother, and sister-in-law had all left. They said they had no intention of leaving until the situation was resolved. In fact, in the next few minutes, 2 cops became 4 as more arrived for some reason. This gave my parents an extra incentive to hurry. I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock he had put on my front door. I got another lock the next day anyway, as I wasn't sure if he had copies of the keys. He was very reluctant to hand them over. Instead of giving them to me, he threw them down the street and into a storm drain, saying I could go get them myself. But a cop scolded him and made him retrieve them. He had to remove the grate to reach them and got quite dirty in the process. When he got the keys back, he grumbled and slammed them into my hand. I then told them all to leave and never come back. My mother said I would be disowned for this, as if it were a threat. I told them as much. Then, in an overly sarcastic tone, I said something like, "Oh no, that means I won't get to spend holidays with you guys where I'm always treated like crap anyway. Because Dan has always been your favorite. You treated me so badly when I was growing up that if Dan ever needs an organ donor, I wouldn't give him a thing. So do like you always told me when I was mistreated, and suck it up." My parents were stunned after I said all that. The 4 cops also looked rather judgmental of them. I tell you, confronting parents like mine in front of cops is a great way to put them on the spot. They're less likely to do something stupid then. My mother started crying and walked away. My father just stood there, looking like he wanted to hit me. Dan just held his kids in defeat, and my sister-in-law was having a tantrum on my front lawn. Soon, they all formed a line and started taking their stuff out of the house. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so it was removed quickly. But while they were doing it, my mother kept saying it wasn't too late and that I could still do it for Dan, trying to bargain more and more to change my mind. She said Dan could pay me rent if I let them stay. When that didn't work, she said I could move back in with them and let Dan rent my house so I wouldn't have to share. I told her to shut up and keep packing because I didn't want Dan or his family around, I didn't want his money, and I definitely didn't want to live with them or my parents again after how they treated me as a child. Making a deal with my parents would be like making a deal with the devil. My sister-in-law had another tantrum after hearing that, threw a box, and sat on the ground to have a pity party because she didn't want to go back to living with my parents. She just sat there, looking angry and sad, until everyone else was finished. She didn't even want to get up when it was time to leave. They finally got everything out of the house and into the truck. Before they left, I gave my parents one last piece of my mind about all the crap they had put me through growing up. With the 4 cops present, they couldn't do much but stand there and take it. I called them out on numerous things. I even pointed out how they couldn't have been nice to me, like letting me park my camper at their place when I was homeless and trying to get back on my feet. Instead, they let Dan and my sister-in-law mock me and call me a bum. Well, who's the bum now? They wanted to kick me out of my own house so Dan could live in it for free, yet when I needed a place to stay, they wanted to overcharge me just to park my camper when I was unemployed. The cops gave them even more disapproving looks when I said all that. So I put my parents on the spot again and asked them what I had ever done, other than being born, to deserve such treatment. Because when I finally achieved some success in life, they wanted to take it away for their favorite child, as if they preferred me to have nothing while giving everything to Dan. I bought this house with my own hard-earned money. I owed them nothing, and I would never ask them for anything again. Clearly, I was nothing more than a doormat or a cash cow in their eyes. I got no response from them. They just stood there, looking dumbfounded. So I continued ranting and asked them what on earth made them think they were good parents after all this. My father's face turned beet red, more from embarrassment than anger this time. My mother cried, saying she was a horrible person. I agreed wholeheartedly. They were all horrible, and I bet they'll end up in hell for it. They knew they were shitty people, but if I had confronted them privately instead of publicly, they would have just gotten angry and still blamed me. They had been in denial for so long that it had become part of their identity. My mother buried her face in my father's jacket and cried. My father looked more defeated than I had ever seen him. Dan and his family avoided me completely as they finished loading the truck. I made sure none of my things were stolen. I didn't have much furniture at the time. I was lucky to have a couch. They all got in their vehicles, and my sister-in-law just stared at me with malice until my brother finally got her to drive the minivan home. As soon as they were gone, I went back online and shared what had happened. My parents were too embarrassed to defend themselves this time. Before this incident, the family was somewhat divided, but now it was overwhelmingly in my favor. Almost the entire family sided with me, and those who didn't simply remained neutral. No matter how much my parents tried the "we did it for Dan" line, no one listened anymore. So any remaining family support they had was gone. Many family members I didn't expect to side with me did. Even the former flying monkeys. I guess they had finally had enough. Around that time, I offered to host half the family on Christmas Eve at my new house. My parents were not invited. Surprisingly, I wasn't blocked on my brother and sister-in-law social media profiles. I saw that my sister-in-law had her fourth baby in early November. They were still living with my parents. I'm pretty sure they knew I was watching because my sister-in-law kept making passive-aggressive posts every few weeks about not having enough space at my parents' house. Probably trying to guilt me, and I'm sure it was driving my parents crazy. They must not be getting any peace and quiet in their old age with 3 rowdy kids, a mentally unstable daughter-in-law, my spoiled brother, and a newborn baby all under one roof. Maybe they should move into a camper in their own backyard and let Dan have their house. They might get some peace that way. Yeah, they could do that for Dan. I had initially planned to confine my account of this affair to just 2 posts. However, as I was assembling all the details, I realized that part 2 had become excessively long. Consequently, I've split it into a part 3. For those who were quick to recommend getting cameras, I do intend to do so when my financial situation permits. I'm still in the process of recovering financially from purchasing a house last year. Moreover, as far as I'm aware, good quality cameras typically require a reasonably powerful computer for recording. And all I possess is a 3-year-old laptop running Windows 10. Yes, I'm familiar with doorbell cams, and that will likely be the first type I acquire. For those who insisted that I should have simply had my brother and sister-in-law arrested, the sole reason I refrained was because they are parents. Their children depend on them. If Dan were to be arrested, he would almost certainly lose his job. And without that income, his family would have no means of support. Additionally, my sister-in-law has a baby who is only a few months old. Neither of them needs to end up in jail. However, revenge doesn't necessarily require incarceration. The police can be of assistance, yes, but I managed to obtain a form of payback without even filing a police report. Would I be as lenient again in the future? It's highly improbable, and they're well aware of that. I made the decision to postpone creating an account and sharing my story until after the new year, just in case any further developments occurred. And, as expected, more events unfolded. As previous readers are aware, my sister-in-law had been making passive-aggressive posts on social media that were evidently directed at me. This was especially prominent after she gave birth to her 4th child in November. She was repeating the same tiresome drivel over and over, merely finding somewhat clever ways to rephrase it. Essentially, she kept whining about being fed up with living with my parents, complaining that there wasn't enough space, and expressing her desire for her own house. I realize I might sound dismissive, but if you had endured what I have with these individuals, you too would be inclined to sarcastically play tiny violins in their presence. They are truly that dreadful. Since I waited until January to establish an account, additional incidents transpired, precisely as I had anticipated. I mentioned previously that I had invited half of the family to a Christmas Eve party at my house. Remarkably, everyone I invited showed up, despite the rather long journey of approximately 3 to 4 hours for them. Their motivation was to come and demonstrate their support for me. I received numerous compliments from them regarding the arduous effort I had put in to acquire a house independently, and they expressed their remorse for all the hardships I had endured. I was asked why I hadn't simply taken my camper and driven the 3 hours back to them instead of living in a near-homeless state for such an extended period. I had to admit rather sheepishly that I had a strong attachment to living in this area, and it offered the best employment opportunities in my field. My hometown lacked significant job prospects in my line of work, if any at all. I was determined to make my own way as much as possible. They generally accepted this explanation, and we proceeded to have a truly delightful party. It was the best one I had experienced in years. Some relatives even brought CDs of wonderful Christmas albums. I must say, the one my uncle brought of Ray Charles was my absolute favorite. His renditions of Christmas songs were truly unique. It was a magnificent and joyous occasion. For a brief moment, I felt as though I could set aside my past troubles and simply relish the present. But, of course, if everything had remained so idyllic, I wouldn't be writing this now. Approximately 2 hours into the party, the unwelcome guests arrived. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law barged in, attempting to appear all smiles. They didn't even bother to knock. They simply walked straight through my front door as if they were entitled to be there. I immediately turned off the music and ordered them to leave without delay. They pleaded to stay, claiming they had brought gifts. Before I could utter another word, one of my uncles stood up and shouted at them, declaring that they didn't deserve to be in my home or in my life after the despicable stunt they had pulled months earlier. He was supported by several other relatives. It's worth noting that this particular uncle is my mother's brother. He had previously adored her until he learned about the atrocious events that had transpired between me and my parents. My grandparents, my mother's parents, despite their advanced age, quickly interposed themselves and informed my parents that if they wished to make amends with me, it was far too soon. They had never been more disappointed in them than they were in the past year. They had concealed their favoritism towards my brother from prying eyes for a long time, but no one was deceived any longer. They emphasized that my parents needed to make a sincere and concerted effort to actually treat me like a son if they ever hoped to have a place in my life again. Then they turned to Dan and my sister-in-law and stated that they had seen the repetitive and pointless posts my sister-in-law had been making. They were tired of it and urged her to let it go. My house would never become their new residence. My sister-in-law reverted to her typical behavior of bursting into tears and throwing a pity party, lamenting that she should be the one living in this house instead of me. She plopped down in a chair and had a tantrum, whining that it wasn't fair that I had this house to myself when I had no family of my own, while she had 4 children who needed more space. She claimed she merely wanted a better place to live and to feel like a real mother. It was perhaps a bit petty of me, but I loudly pointed out that she was a lousy mother because she allowed my mother to handle most of the parenting while she lounged around all day, drinking, playing on her phone, or squandering all of Dan's money. And she had the audacity to complain about it. I even jested that I was astonished her baby didn't get drunk from her breast milk considering how much booze she consumed. Admittedly, this comment may have been a bit over the top as I received some disapproving looks. My sister-in-law demanded to know if I was accusing her of being a bad mother. I simply replied that the evidence was self-evident. I further added that if she hoped to be able to afford to move out of my parents' house someday, she needed to put her college degree to good use, get a job, and learn to save money. After all, my mother already took care of most of the child care for my brother's children. So once her baby grew a bit older, she would have ample time. My brother's eldest child, who was 7 years old, rushed over and began kicking and screaming at me for yelling at his mother. He kept haranguing me about how his mother had told him that I was the bad guy who made her cry and wouldn't let them live here. At that moment, my brother intervened and grabbed his son to pull him away. But all the other relatives quickly joined in, and this escalated into a sort of family intervention directed at my sister-in-law and brother. She was crying, her new baby was crying, her children were crying. Even Dan was on the verge of tears from the verbal barrage he was facing. He ended up sitting on the ottoman by the front door where I keep my shoes and looked completely devastated. He couldn't meet anyone's gaze, and he couldn't even muster a couple of words to say to me. Not with a house full of angry relatives ready to condemn him if he dared to exhibit his former entitled behavior. Had they not been present to restrain him, I suspect this would have devolved into a repeat of the incident months earlier when he had tried to order me around and take my house. By this point, however, he had been so thoroughly humiliated that his and my parents' reputation within the family had been utterly ruined. The facades had crumbled, and their true natures were now exposed. Soon after, my parents, brother, and sister-in-law left in defeat. The party resumed, and we all avoided discussing the recent events for the remainder of the evening. Since most of the adults had been drinking, everyone stayed the night in my house. I even allowed some of them to sleep in the camper, which proved to be a convenient additional accommodation. I must admit, it serves as a rather nice guest house. My relatives had all expressed an interest in touring it earlier, and they were astonished that I had lived in it for approximately 2 years. I fielded numerous questions about it, such as what summers and winters were like. I woke up earlier than everyone else on Christmas morning and prepared a fresh pot of coffee and some ibuprofen for those suffering from the aftereffects of the spiked eggnog. I was complimented on being a far more gracious host than my parents had ever been, and we all agreed to repeat this celebration next Christmas. After Christmas, my sister-in-law finally ceased making posts that were blatant jabs at me and deleted all of the previous ones. However, shortly after the new year, she made a new post complaining about how she had attempted to persuade my parents to get a camper similar to mine and set it up in the backyard so that Dan and his family could have the entire house as their family home. Well, as they say, a taste of one's own medicine is never pleasant. Apparently, my parents vehemently rejected this idea. No one was going to force them out of their own home, let alone their master bedroom. The post was only visible for a couple of days before my sister-in-law removed it, and she has scarcely posted anything since then. She loves to complain, but if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it still make a sound? In this case, my sister-in-law has seemingly realized that there's no point in complaining when no one is listening anymore. And Dan is unlikely to be able to afford to move his family out on his salary alone in the near future. If they end up expecting another child in the next few years, I wouldn't be at all surprised. Since then, things have calmed down for me. I've even hosted a poker night with friends. I'm not very good at poker as I can never remember the rules. But that doesn't matter. We had a great time drinking beer and indulging in junk food while being carefree and having a laugh. We all stocked up on Whoppers from Burger King and simply enjoyed ourselves in the best way 4 grown men can when they just want to have an uncomplicated and enjoyable time and get a bit tipsy. I think perhaps around summer I'll consider the possibility of dating someone. I'm not getting any younger, after all. Let's hope it goes well. My camper now sits idly in my yard. I confess, there have been days when I've gone out there just to spend some time in it. After all, I lived in it for 2 years. It feels like a second home, and maybe one day I'll actually use it for camping as it was originally intended. I've never been camping before. My parents regarded it as a waste of time, so it would be a completely new and exciting experience for me. This essentially marks the conclusion of these events. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law have been keeping their distance from me. In fact, they seem to have reverted to pretending I don't exist, just as they did before I purchased the house. But that doesn't bother me in the slightest. It's better this way. However, I'm certain they'll resurface in some manner. I know they will. I'm just curious about what sort of foolishness they'll attempt next. If anything significant occurs again, I'll make another post if this account remains active. This development might not come as a shock to some of those who commented on my prior posts, as my parents have engaged in precisely the sort of behavior that was anticipated. They were after either my money or my signature. I had expected the typical narcissistic lines, such as claims that I owed them or some socialist-inspired drivel about sharing the wealth. However, it was more of a similar, albeit milder, scenario. It appears they have learned not to overstep with me and were mainly aiming for my sympathy. It all began when my parents reached out to me via social media and requested a meeting at a public location of my choosing. It reeked of a trap, but I wasn't intimidated. In fact, I was rather entertained. They are aware that I won't be easily manipulated anymore. So, I was eager to discover their motives this time. I selected a local eatery, perhaps one with a name reminiscent of an olive in a garden, and we convened there. Dan accompanied them, though he remained mostly silent. We exchanged awkward greetings, ordered some beverages, and then got straight to the point. My parents implored me to assist Dan in obtaining his own apartment so he could finally vacate their residence. Apparently, Dan's credit is less than stellar. I wonder why? Could it be due to his wife's habitual overspending? Well, they asked me to either provide some funds or co-sign for the apartment and contribute to the rent payments. I promptly declined both offers. That's when Dan erupted in anger and shouted that I had so much while he had a family to support. He needed my help, and since I had no family of my own, I should allocate my funds to his. I chuckled and inquired about their whereabouts when I was in need of assistance. Oh, that's right. They were mocking me for being homeless. Or should we take a trip further back to my childhood? I was quite willing to elaborate with an audience around. My mother grasped my hand and begged me to refrain from speaking of it. My father and Dan both averted their gazes and remained silent. I'm fairly certain they were suppressing their typical retorts. I asked them if they thought I was wealthy. Their expressions said it all. When I informed them that I didn't possess such funds, they stared at me like startled deer. I detailed how much I had managed to save for the down payment on my house and the arduous lifestyle and work I endured to accumulate it so rapidly. Then I explained how nearly all of it was utilized for the down payment. I'm still in the process of financial recuperation. I did have some monthly income to spare, yes, but the majority was funneled into my savings. I asked Dan about his annual salary, and upon his disclosure, I pointed out that it was actually marginally higher than mine. I then roughly calculated in front of my parents, estimating that approximately 70% of my income was allocated to my mortgage, insurance, gasoline, internet, phone, food, and other bills. At most, there was perhaps 30% remaining that could be saved, and I required that savings to regain my financial footing. My truck dates back to the 90s. If it were to malfunction, I'd need funds to repair or replace it. And there are other unforeseen expenses for which one needs a contingency fund, such as home repairs, medical bills, taxes, legal fees, or any sudden, unexpected costs. Thus, as you can see, I simply couldn't afford to assist Dan. Moreover, I refused to co-sign as it would render me liable for any debts Dan couldn't or wouldn't pay. I then noted that this was likely the reason my parents hadn't co-signed for Dan's apartment in the past. My mother promptly burst into tears once more. I had anticipated every move in this encounter. I'm not a cash dispenser, nor a simpleton. I made that abundantly clear to them. I had expected my father to fly into a rage, as was his custom. But this time he didn't. I had known this man to explode at the slightest hint of me not enabling my brother throughout my life. But on this occasion, he refrained. There wasn't even a trace of a sneer on his face. The only way I could describe his expression was one of regret and defeat. Perhaps regret for being a lousy parent. Or maybe regret because he could no longer browbeat me. Who can say? In any event, my parents couldn't really dispute my reasoning, and I wasn't about to part with any money. Dan simply rose and declared that this was all a waste of their time and that he was departing. My mother began apologizing on his behalf, but Dan was resolute in his departure. Then, just to be magnanimous, I offered to purchase a round of unlimited soup and salad for us all. I suppose they couldn't resist free food, considering we had only ordered drinks thus far, and they remained. I made a conscious effort to steer the conversation away from money. Dan remained quiet, either consuming his food or engrossed in his phone. My parents, however, engaged in an awkward dialogue with me. They mentioned that they had recently joined a local Christian church and had been attending for the past 2 weeks. I responded with a perfunctory, "Good for them," and they predictably attempted to persuade me to join. I politely declined, and they were astute enough not to press the issue. When the meal concluded, Dan left a $10 bill on the table for the tip and exited without another word to me or anyone. My mother excused his behavior, and we then went our separate ways. That was essentially the extent of it. Not nearly as much drama as I had anticipated. But this is still a vast improvement compared to my previous interactions with my parents and brother. Regarding SIL, she has been consistently complaining online about my parents. It seems she is disgruntled about not being the reigning authority in their household, and I suspect her toxicity is finally taking a toll on them. Why else would they be so desperate to approach me? SIL actually desires my parents to relocate to a camper, similar to my former situation, to create more space in the house. And she has been met with a resounding no. Each time, she does seem to have a following of like-minded individuals. From time to time, I receive messages from strangers intent on berating me for not relinquishing my house to SIL. I no longer bother to engage in arguments with these people. I simply block them and move on. There was one persistent nuisance who had my phone number and called from different numbers each time. Yes, it appears to be the same person who previously called to claim I needed to make way for a real family man like Dan. But I couldn't care less. The calls seemed to have diminished, if not ceased entirely, because I made it evident to that individual that their continued efforts were merely a source of amusement to me. The last call was around the beginning of the month, and since then, there has been silence. Well, I had initially intended to provide an update after approximately half a year following the original posts. However, the passage of time has been longer than anticipated. Indeed, things did take a turn for the worse again. But For the most part, it hasn't been too arduous for me. Since last Christmas, I've been relatively unscathed, aside from the incident when my parents and Dan approached me for money, as detailed in my previous post, and a more recent altercation with SIL that I will elaborate on herein. I did install several cameras in my house, including a Ring doorbell at the front entrance. I refrained from informing my family about the cameras, just to be cautious. Thus far, thankfully, no one has attempted a break-in. I believe that my previous public exposure of their actions has intimidated them into leaving me alone, at least to a significant extent. I've decided to rent out 2 of the rooms in my house. One is occupied by a close friend, and the other by a friend of my close friend. Both have proven to be excellent tenants. They understand the importance of maintaining a quiet environment and respecting my privacy, and they even have small refrigerators in their rooms, eliminating the need to store their beverages in the main fridge. The rental deal I offered them was so favorable that they couldn't resist. This has substantially increased my monthly income. Even after accounting for taxes, I'm still able to deposit a respectable sum into the bank each month, as the rent payments cover a significant portion of my mortgage. You're likely all curious about how my parents, brother, and SIL reacted to my decision to rent out the rooms to friends. Well, the response was far from favorable. My father and Dan chose to remain silent on the matter. However, SIL had a meltdown, which led my mother to approach me in tears, lamenting why I hadn't rented the rooms to Dan and his family instead. We engaged in a rather heated argument, during which I pointed out several crucial factors. Firstly, they had previously broken into my house in an attempt to steal it. Surely, she wouldn't want to live with someone who had committed such an act. Secondly, there simply wasn't sufficient space in my house for me, Dan, and his entire family. It's a 3-bedroom manufactured home, and I occupy the master bedroom with its adjoining bathroom. That would have left only 2 small rooms for Dan, SIL, and their 4 children. Moreover, they would have been an incessant source of annoyance for me. Additionally, it's well known that I can't tolerate SIL's presence, as she deliberately provokes me. And let's not forget that they all ridicule me when I was homeless. In contrast, my current tenants are 2 single men in their 30s with whom I have a good rapport. My mother offered a series of tearful excuses, but eventually conceded and admitted that she was simply desperate. Edit. My parents discovered that I was renting out the rooms because SIL had been essentially stalking me. She then informed my parents, who subsequently contacted me. Subsequently, my mother came to my house to weep about it. Since then, my parents have refrained from bothering me regarding the house. Thus, things have been relatively smooth for me. However, the situation is far from ideal for my parents and Dan. It turns out that SIL is an even more detestable person than I had initially believed. I was already aware that she was a master of gaslighting, self-victimization, and drama. But she stooped to new lows. It was revealed that Dan's youngest child was not his. Yes, you read that correctly. SIL had an affair. In retrospect, this perhaps isn't entirely unexpected. Some astute individuals here had predicted this months ago. After being caught, SIL was ostracized from the family. Dan has recently finalized his divorce, which fortunately proceeded in his favor, given that we reside in an at-fault state. Dan also took legal action to have his name removed from the birth certificate of the youngest child and emerged victorious. Essentially, following the incident where my parents attempted to force me to relinquish my house, chaos ensued at their residence. SIL placed a significant amount of blame on me. She was under the delusion that I was extremely wealthy, as if I had won the lottery, and that I should share my riches. Apparently, it was her idea to attend my Christmas party, as she hoped they could all win me over. It was also her brainchild to have my parents and Dan solicit money from me for an apartment. Thus, it was a rude awakening for her when Dan and my parents informed her of my actual financial situation. For an extended period, she had successfully indoctrinated Dan and my parents with her toxic mindset, fueling their narcissism. Consequently, her blame game led the others to target me as well. However, this changed after the incident in front of the police when they tried to steal my house. That was the beginning of SIL's downfall. My parents and Dan were initially hesitant to attend my Christmas party, given how I had publicly exposed them. But SIL convinced them to hastily assemble a few inexpensive gifts and show up, believing that he'd never expel us once we're already inside. How wrong she was. I, with the full support of all my invited guests, promptly ejected her and the rest of them. Her seemingly clever plan backfired spectacularly. I surmised that being chastised by the family at my party not only further damaged my parents' reputation, but also served as a wake-up call, eventually leading them to stop heeding SIL's advice. As I mentioned in my previous post, my parents decided to return to church. Perhaps it was because last year I had suggested that they might face consequences for their actions. I can't confirm that this was the motivation. However, it would be rather satisfying if it were the case. It's worth noting that my parents hadn't attended church in 2 decades prior to their recent return. While I don't oppose their decision to attend church, they must understand that it doesn't erase their past misdeeds. Nevertheless, I have some hope that they're making an effort, as my parents visited my house without Dan to offer a sincere apology after viewing an animated video of my first 3 posts. That's right, they have been aware of this Reddit account for a considerable time. They're also cognizant of everything I've written. Yes, they are displeased about it, but I believe that everyone here merits an update, given the anonymity of the platform. For my parents and Dan, watching an animated video of themselves and their actions was a powerful means of self-reflection. They subsequently came to my house to apologize. I had never witnessed my father apologize in such a manner, and given that he isn't a proficient actor, it felt genuine. They fully acknowledged their mistreatment of me and admitted that there was no justifiable excuse. They even self-identified as narcissists and conceded the severity of their wrongdoings. They then proceeded to place a significant amount of blame on SIL. Indeed, they somewhat threw her under the bus. But it's undeniable that she was culpable for all the accusations they leveled. My parents have also been undergoing counseling for a while and even proposed group family counseling. However, I declined, as I'm not prepared for such an undertaking in the near future. Dan himself took some time to offer an apology to me, but whenever the past was brought up, he appeared deeply remorseful. Meanwhile, Dan and SIL's marriage disintegrated in a rather dramatic fashion. It wasn't a gradual decline, but a rapid and catastrophic collapse. Without me as the convenient scapegoat, black sheep, or ATM that they could ridicule or attempt to extract money from, and following the public humiliation via social media, my Reddit posts, and the animated online video, SIL finally unleashed enough of her toxicity on Dan and my parents for them to recognize her true nature. Their denial had been strong, but SIL's sense of entitlement was even more potent. I've had numerous whimsical thoughts of a lightsaber duel in the midst of this drama, with SIL donning a bimbo Sith costume and wielding a lightsaber resembling a giant lipstick. I'm sure there are countless puns and jokes that could be crafted from such an image, but I didn't dwell too deeply on it. As you can imagine, things only deteriorated further as SIL continued to search for alternative means to achieve her desires. She repeatedly presented ads for used campers and RVs, attempting to persuade my parents to purchase one and live in it so that they could have the main house. She persisted in this behavior despite their repeated rejections. She even suggested that my parents should buy an RV and embark on a nomadic lifestyle, as is common among some retirees. Such a proposal was absurd, even for SIL. In contrast, my parents proposed that Dan and SIL buy a camper themselves and live in it. SIL vehemently objected, claiming that she shouldn't have to do so, as she was the mother. She effectively used her perceived parental authority to assert dominance, given that all the children in the house were hers. When SIL didn't get her way, she actually absconded with her baby and disappeared for several days. They knew she was safe as her phone was operational, and she responded to texts with brief, passive-aggressive messages. When she returned, she was even more embittered, as no one had capitulated to her demands during her absence. SIL also refused to attend church. However, Dan accompanied our parents and took his children, with the exception of the youngest, as SIL forbade him from taking the baby anywhere. Personally, I don't attend church. I do believe in God and related concepts, but I simply don't enjoy the church environment. Moreover, it didn't prove beneficial to me during my upbringing. The situation truly spiraled out of control when Dan unexpectedly accused his wife of infidelity in March. This revelation came as a shock to all of us, as we had regarded him as completely subservient to her. However, it turns out that he is not. At least, not anymore. You are all aware of how he treated me when I was on his bad side. Well, his wife did not escape his wrath either. After finally coming to his senses, he began piecing together the evidence of her deception and secretly obtained DNA tests for all of his children. 3 of the kids are his, but the youngest, the baby, is not. For the record, both Dan and I have very dark, straight hair that is almost black, as do our parents. SIL's hair is also straight and fairly dark. However, the baby's hair is lighter and slightly curly. At first, Dan assumed it was due to the baby's age. SIL kept dismissing it, claiming that it would darken over time, but it never did. I suppose that was Dan's most significant clue. He confronted his wife with the DNA results in the presence of our parents. She broke down in tears, insisting it was a mistake. SIL resorted to all the typical Darvo tactics of denial, trickle-truthing, and gaslighting. But Dan was having none of it. In fact, he had conducted a more extensive investigation into her affair than I could have ever imagined. I knew he was intelligent. He had just allowed himself to act foolishly. He had detailed proof of her cheating, including phone records, texts retrieved from her phone, bank records, and the DNA test. He even identified the man with whom she was having an affair, who was likely the father since he has much lighter, curly hair. The evidence against her was indisputable, and Dan said she was so inept at concealing her affair that he had no difficulty uncovering it once he started looking down. My parents immediately demanded that SIL leave their house. That's when she went berserk. It began with just shouting, but she quickly became violent. My mother had to call the police. Indeed, SIL was arrested. She scratched Dan and my father quite severely with her long, fake nails, and even injured her eldest child in the process. The child got a black eye and a nosebleed when he tried to intervene. Dan was astute enough to have his phone recording nearby when he confronted her. Thus, the police had all the necessary evidence to arrest her for assault. SIL's parents had to drive over to bail her out. Then they returned to collect the baby, SIL's belongings, and her car. A couple of days after SIL was bailed out, she showed up at my house, as I apparently ranked high on her list of targets. As soon as I opened the door, she launched into a delusional tirade, accusing me of posting on Reddit and proclaiming that I was the entitled bane of her existence. I'm not certain, but I suspect she might have been under the influence of something, as her behavior seemed even more erratic than usual, and her eyes looked abnormal. She claimed that mothers with young children were the most sacred beings in the world, and then yelled that giving up my house should not have been an excessive request. She argued that supporting the family was the least I could have done, and that if I had, her family would still be intact. When I attempted to speak while she was ranting, she actually tried to shove me and cover my mouth. She even had her hand raised as if ready to scratch me. Well, as you might expect, I did not take kindly to being threatened. I informed her that I would call the police if she did not remove her hands from me immediately. I also told her that I had recorded everything on my doorbell camera. She panicked the moment she heard the word camera. I then verbally tore into her until she retreated from my porch. I told her she had the audacity to call me entitled when she was the epitome of entitlement. She had not worked for anything she possessed, had cheated on her husband and become pregnant by her affair partner, made my mother do the majority of the parenting for her children, spent Dan's money until they were in a financial crisis, and had been so entitled as to attempt to steal my home. I described her as entitled to the 1000th degree and called her a greedy bitch blinded by narcissism. I then ordered her to stop blaming me for her actions and to never return to my house. Hearing all of that was apparently all SIL needed to hear before she hastily jumped back in her car, sped off, and left. This was the final straw for me. Now that she was separated from Dan, I finally went to the police and filed a report against her for harassment and the assault she had committed against me last year. Her recent attempt to lay hands on me at my front porch only added to the charges. The police have it all on record now. I also provided copies of the video to Dan for his divorce lawyer. And yes, I did apply for a restraining order against SIL, which was easily granted given her clearly unstable behavior. She has not made any social media posts about me that I have seen since then, but that's only because she has made her profile private. I hope her campaign of blaming me has finally come to an end. In any case, she has left me alone. SIL was still involved with her affair partner during the divorce. At the time, I had no real understanding of what kind of man he was. But anyone who gets involved with a married person and has a child with them clearly lacks moral scruples. Once the divorce proceedings began, SIL admitted that Dan was no longer man enough for her because he could not afford to provide the lifestyle she desired. She actually believed herself to be on par with a trophy wife and that she deserved to be with someone wealthy. Dan said he responded with a me and laughed maniacally. He told her she was far from attractive enough to be a trophy wife and also pointed out her other flaws. SIL was humiliated by this and fled like a child. Due to having to live with her parents, SIL was compelled to work in their family business, as Dan had cut off her access to his bank accounts. She had already maxed out all the credit cards he had previously given her. She complained about having to work for her parents despite having a college degree. But I suspect they were the only ones who would employ her, given her criminal record and a decade-long gap in her resume. I heard from Dan that her parents were extremely disappointed in her. However, that could just be a rumor. For all I know, they might be just as bad as she is. In any event, the chaotic divorce process really took off once it got underway. SIL did not emerge from it with much. especially considering that she had an affair, physically harmed her father-in-law, husband, and eldest child, and given that it is an at-fault state, as I mentioned earlier. So she said goodbye to any hope of getting her way. I will provide more details in the final post. Dan's lawyer pulled quite a few strings to expedite the divorce process. However, it came at a cost, although I'm not privy to the specific details or the exact amount. They never shared that information with me. On the other hand, SIL was pushed into a dire financial corner. And as we know, when an animal is cornered, it tends to fight back. She did exactly that, but the law was firmly against her, and her finances were rapidly dwindling. SIL's parents had to foot the bill for a lawyer for her, and unfortunately, it wasn't a particularly skilled one. Moreover, she actually brought her affair partner to the divorce court to testify on her behalf. This guy was quite a character. He had a silver tongue and a charming smile that he tried to use to his advantage. He claimed that SIL had been wronged by an incompetent husband, which was why she had sought solace in another man's arms. He asserted that he was ready to take responsibility for the child he had fathered with SIL, but also argued that SIL would still require alimony to support herself and care for the child. He even stated that since Dan was still on the birth certificate at the time, alimony should be one of his obligations. Dan remarked that this guy might use big words and flash a charming smile, but he seemed exceptionally stupid. And coming from Dan, that's quite a statement. The judge wasn't swayed in the slightest and told this smooth-talking fellow that he was a hypocrite for claiming to be ready to take responsibility for his own child while simultaneously reaching out for money from the man whose marriage he had helped destroy. That shut him up promptly. Dan had initially intended to sue his wife's affair partner for alienation of affection. However, that plan fell through. I suppose it would have been up to Dan to prove the depth of her love for him prior to the affair. But after her true nature was revealed and we saw the real her, we're not even sure if she had ever truly loved him at all or if she was simply using him as a meal ticket. Someone had pointed out that SIL might have kept having children to avoid having to get a job, and that might very well have been the case. In any event, SIL attempted to drag out the divorce proceedings, but Dan's lawyer and the judge managed to prevent that from happening to a large extent. I swear, Dan must have been extremely lucky to get one of the toughest and least sympathetic judges in the state when it came to dealing with cheaters. And with all the evidence we had against SIL, it was easy to prevent her from playing the victim. So, instead, she let her true, unpleasant self show, as there was no point in hiding it any longer. The court had access to all the records provided by Dan and myself, including police reports, photos, and recordings that clearly demonstrated she was an abusive narcissist. It was like a mountain of evidence standing against her, one that she had no way to overcome or bypass. She tried to resist, but it was like being in prime avalanche territory. In the end, to bring the divorce to a swift conclusion, SIL struck a deal. Dan agreed to take on 3/4 of the credit card debt, got his name removed from the birth certificate of the affair baby, and SIL ended up with only partial custody of her children. She received no alimony, but was also relieved of most of the credit card debt she had accumulated. Since she was now legally employed by her parents, she had an income of her own to start paying off her remaining debts. She could see her other children almost whenever she wanted and could take them on weekends. However, for some reason, she has made very few attempts to actually visit them. She took them out for fast food a few times, but never took them home with her. The kids are back in school now, which further limits her opportunities to see them. You'd think her parents would be eager to see their grandchildren, but they haven't contacted Dan about it. They hardly saw Dan's children before, and now it seems they might not bother at all. It's unclear if they dislike children or what the reason is. Even Dan doesn't know. But he did mention that his in-laws had always been rather indifferent to him. As for Dan, he had truly loved his wife deeply. So, the betrayal of her infidelity hit him hard. Rewind to the night of his confrontation with his wife. He showed up at my place in a daze, clutching a whiskey bottle, his face scratched up and covered in bandages. I wouldn't say he was fully drunk yet, but seeing him in that state initially startled me, and I scolded him for driving under the influence. However, compared to the pain of his wife's betrayal, my reprimand didn't seem to register much with him. We spent a few hours in my camper so as not to disturb my tenants. Throughout that time, Dan was drinking whiskey straight from the bottle and crying, lamenting that he was a fool and expressing regret for ever marrying SIL. Nowadays, whenever he mentions her, he simply refers to her as that bitch. So, that's become XSIL's new nickname. Ironically, that time together was the most bonding moment Dan and I had shared in 15 years. While he didn't exactly offer a formal apology to me, he did call himself a lousy human being with terrible taste in women and said that at least I hadn't made the same mistakes as he had. Despite all the wrongs he had committed against me in the past, he's still my younger brother, and I couldn't risk letting him attempt to drive home in that state. So, I told him to stay the night and managed to take his keys. I then set up the bunk in my camper for him to use. After all, I had rented out my spare rooms. He was in no condition to drive, and if he had taken an Uber, he would have had to pay for it and then come back later for his car. He was still a depressed, crying mess and didn't want our parents or his kids to see him like that. Frankly, I was worried he might do something reckless if I let him leave. I didn't trust him enough to let him sleep in the house, so the camper was the best option. Just because that bitch had betrayed him didn't mean I suddenly had complete faith in him. So, it was better for him to sober up in the camper. We both spent time in the camper playing games and watching movies on my portable DVD player. Poker wasn't much fun with just two people, and Old Maid was rather dull. Thankfully, I also had an Uno deck and an old-school battleship game. He really enjoyed those. It was enough to keep him distracted until he finally ran out of whiskey and was willing to lie down. He ended up vomiting quite a bit into a bucket, but he didn't seem to mind sleeping in my camper. In fact, he thought it was kind of cool. Dan had numerous questions for me about how I had managed to live in the camper for such a long time, and I answered them all, partly just to keep him occupied. But I needed to get some sleep myself since I had to be up early. So, I left him with my portable DVD player and a couple of movies so that he could entertain himself if he managed to stay awake. Before leaving for work in the morning, I checked on him while he was passed out in the bunk and left a bottle of ibuprofen, an energy drink, his car keys, and a letter explaining how to leave through the backyard gate on the counter of the camper's kitchenette. He managed to let himself out without any issues around 1:30 p.m., about a month after XSIL, aka that bitch, was kicked out. Dan came to me asking to borrow my camper. I guess he had found it more comfortable than I had expected when he slept in it. He fully admitted that he hadn't asked earlier due to pride. But with his soon-to-be ex-wife out of the house, he had decided to give up his room for his eldest child. He has 2 girls and a boy, with the boy being the eldest and now 8 years old. The kids had been forced to share a room until then, with just curtains separating the boy's side of the room. But the boy often chose to sleep on the couch to avoid his sisters. I knew the poor kid was desperate for his own room. So, I suppose Dan finally made a better decision as a father and came to me to beg to borrow my camper so his son could have his own space. If he could have afforded it, he would have bought his own camper instead of relying on me. And he even said as much. I hadn't even had the chance to use the camper for actual camping yet, but I relented and let him use it since it was for a good cause. He promised to buy his own in due time. No, I didn't ask for rent money for the camper. Dan is already in a significant financial bind because of the divorce and XSIL's actions. I've learned that I tend to get better results with my family lately by not being vindictive. I loaded up the camper and placed it in my parents' backyard. My father installed a 30-amp breaker so that Dan would have enough power to run the heat and AC when needed. I do miss the camper. After living in it for so long, it had almost become a part of me. But the only reason I loaned it out was for the sake of Dan's kids. Pretty much the only reason I still do anything for my parents or Dan is because of those kids, as I've grown attached to them. And yes, I know I might not get the camper back for quite some time, and it likely won't be in the same condition as when I lent it out. However, I've warned Dan and my parents that they will be financially responsible for any damage to the camper, as well as its upkeep while they have it. I also took numerous time-stamped pictures and videos of the inside and outside of the camper before lending it out, so I can prove its condition prior to its departure. Dan even recorded a video with me agreeing to these terms, which is as good as a contract. With the financial strain of the divorce, I suspect Dan won't be able to afford his own place for years. Although he doesn't seem to complain about living in the camper, I'm not sure if he actually likes it or if he's just putting on a brave face. But I can imagine it might remind him of the backyard forts we had as kids, as it sometimes felt that way to me. In any case, he's currently living in it. I receive a lot of praise from the extended family for letting him borrow it. I'm now often referred to by many of them as the good brother Dan doesn't deserve. In a way, getting rid of SIL was a significant first step in mending the family as a whole. I still don't hold my brother and parents in high regard given how they treated me throughout my life, but I'm not going to let Dan's kids suffer because of that. Those kids have really warmed up to me. They're actually happy to see me when I visit them or when they come over to my place. I've even babysat for them a few times. Now that they're free from their mother's toxic influence, they've become much nicer children, especially towards me. I'm actually starting to enjoy being an uncle. My mother is still handling the majority of the parenting for my nieces and nephews, and she's been on her best behavior to stay in my good graces. My father often appears defeated in my presence, but otherwise, He's been either stoically quiet or generally pleasant towards me. However, he doesn't engage in much conversation with me. Still, that's a vast improvement compared to how he used to be. I'm not letting my guard down, though. My parents do seem happier now that XSAL is out of the picture. They often mention that they don't understand what they ever saw in her. My mother in particular, as the two of them had clashed over who was in charge of the household for a long time. Now, for the final part. During the divorce proceedings, Dan also sued to have his name removed from the birth certificate of the baby that wasn't his. That bitch didn't want to make the change because it would mean losing the child support from Dan if she did. However, there was a court-ordered paternity test for the man identified as the baby's father. I was prepared to laugh if it turned out he wasn't the father either, but he was. Dan's lawyer had a lengthy discussion with XSIL's lawyer. XSIL had no valid argument left and couldn't afford to fight Dan any further. So, she agreed to change the birth certificate. The smooth-talking man who had fathered the child did step up to take financial responsibility as a parent, but he ended up breaking up with SIL. He contacted Dan through his lawyer to inform him that he had ended things with that bitch and that he wouldn't bother Dan again. I checked the social media of that guy after Dan shared the link with me. The man was upset that he was now financially responsible for a child he hadn't planned for and that he felt too young for this situation. Guys, according to what Dan's lawyer was able to find out, that man is over 40. He might look younger, but he's definitely not a young man. Shortly after that, he made his online profile private. XSL had done the same with hers a long time ago. So, I don't have any more information to share. This might very well be the end of this saga. XSIL is out of our lives. My parents and brother are finally making a genuine effort to be better people. I'm surprisingly enjoying being an uncle, and my house remains mine. It's hardly a shock that XSIL came across my Reddit posts. Thanks to the restraining order I have against her, she can't communicate with me regarding them in any way other than through a lawyer. And considering how financially depleted she is after the divorce, it's highly unlikely she can afford to hire a lawyer at the moment. So, she took her complaints to Dan, demanding that he tell me to delete my Reddit account. However, not only has Dan read my recent posts, but he also couldn't care less. He stated that they serve as a reminder of the jerk he used to be, and he's not losing any sleep over it. Besides, despite all the wrongs he committed against me, I've still been there to help him out. So, he's not going to get worked up about it. My parents have also been making an effort to treat Dan and me more equally whenever I'm around. My father, though, remains a man of few words in my presence. As someone pointed out, after such a long time of treating me so differently from Dan, he now seems at a loss as to how to connect with me. And I think that's quite accurate. Still, I don't mind how he is these days. My mother, on the other hand, has developed a habit of constantly apologizing for every little thing when I'm around. Dan informed me that both she and my father have received a lot of criticism from the extended family and their counselor. As a result, my mother now feels compelled to apologize for just about everything. This is a complete turnaround from how they used to behave towards me. I also didn't mention before what XSL's stance was on Dan borrowing my camper, so that his son could have the bedroom that used to be hers and Dan's. Well, true to her bully-like nature, she looked down on him and mocked him for it, claiming that he was now living like a bum. But Dan took it all in stride. He simply asked her if she was done yet, knowing full well that this was exactly how she'd react. And he truly doesn't care anymore. She's as good as dead to him, and her insults just fall on deaf ears. Then he pointed out to her that he was living in the camper because he was putting his kids' needs ahead of his own, so his son could have his own room. Something she, as their mother, had never done. She had always used her children and pregnancies as weapons to avoid working and to emotionally manipulate everyone. Then he asked her to remind him how that had worked out for her. Bear in mind that this was early on in their divorce. I'm sure you can all imagine her reaction. Dan said that his ex had quite the tantrum about my recent posts, but no one has bothered to contact me on her behalf to ask me to take them down. So, she just has to live with the shame she so rightfully deserves. She's been attempting to act nicer towards Dan lately. I guess living with her parents isn't as pleasant as she thought it would be. Dan tolerates her presence when they meet, solely because she's the mother of his children. But that's as far as it goes. He has made it abundantly clear that he will never take her back. He's told me that he can't ever look at her the way he used to, and just the thought of her makes him emotionally detached. So, XSIL really has no hope of reconciling with him. I haven't come across any new information regarding XSIL's affair partner. His social media remains locked down, and the same goes for XSIL's. And it's likely to stay that way as long as there's a possibility of me accessing them. This incident took place in the middle of the night, or more precisely, in the very early hours of the first. I have my suspicions that it was my ex-SIL behind it, but the person caught on my cameras was dressed in multiple layers of heavy sweats, with their face wrapped up and large glasses covering their eyes. It was impossible to tell whether it was a man or a woman. They came on foot, so there was no way to identify a vehicle. They did seem to be around ex-SIL's height, though that alone isn't really solid evidence. If it was indeed ex-SIL, she was aware of my cameras, and covering herself up like that for what seems like a petty act of revenge was probably the smartest move she's made in a long time. Kudos to her for finally putting that college degree to some use, by egging a rather old and beat-up pickup truck. The egg thrower showed up around 3 a.m. I was sound asleep and didn't hear a thing. However, it was wasted no time in chucking about a dozen eggs all over my truck. At least they didn't attempt to cause any further damage, and they were gone in the blink of an eye once the last egg was thrown. I didn't discover the mess until I was leaving for work in the morning. I took my truck through a local car wash during my lunch break, which removed most of the egg. I had to do a bit more scrubbing after work as well. Egg isn't exactly kind of paint, but my truck is from the 90s and hardly looks brand new anyway. I did take photos and filed a police report, providing the CCTV footage as evidence. However, so far, nothing has come of it. There wasn't any significant damage, aside from my minor annoyance and the $15 I spent at the car wash. If ex-SIL was the culprit, she was clever enough to only throw eggs and refrain from keying the paint or slashing my tires, meaning my insurance didn't need to get involved. I don't think the police report will lead to much, as the cops seem to dismiss it as probably just a prank by a teenager. I understand they're likely overworked, but at least having the report creates a paper trail in case there are any future incidents. I waited until now to post about this because I was wondering if anything else would happen. But nope, it's been peaceful and quiet since then. I'd really appreciate any good advice regarding this matter, just in case something similar occurs again. Update. I asked around with some of the people on my street about whether their cameras might have captured the person who egged my car. I got a range of responses from "we don't have cameras" to "it was Halloween and people pull stupid pranks. Let it go." The few people who were actually helpful told me that I had waited too long to ask, and that their footage had already auto-deleted. So, basically, the egg thrower got away with it. But if it was SIL, I'm guessing she had to walk around half a mile in those sweats just to avoid having her car spotted on camera or something. I wouldn't be surprised if she questioned whether it was even worth the effort. Oh well, I guess I'll just wait and see if the egg thrower comes back next year. I did hand out printed pictures of the person though, and I even stapled a few up on posts. So now at least the people in my neighborhood are aware of what happened. The tenants renting the 2 rooms in my house have stayed out of it, and I can't say I blame them. It's not really their problem. To begin with, I returned after a long absence to find my inbox flooded with 500 messages and 130 unanswered private messages, PMs. I'm asking that you please refrain from sending me any more PMs. There are just far too many for me to respond to. So, if you sent me a PM and I clicked ignore, I want to apologize. Please understand that it wasn't personal. I was simply overwhelmed by the sheer volume and didn't feel capable of replying to so many. However, that's not what brought me back to Reddit. I had decided to stay away for at least a year because my previous posts hadn't exactly been helpful in boosting the family's morale. As a result, I hadn't logged in for quite a while. But then, the other day, my brother Dan stumbled upon a video that was astonishingly similar to my story in numerous ways. The only difference was that it was about an original poster, OP, with a twin sister instead of a sister-in-law, SIL. Nevertheless, so many elements were identical. There were entitled, narcissistic parents, a guy who had been treated horribly throughout his life, and even ended up homeless, a golden child sibling, the parents keeping their favoritism a closely guarded secret while the OP was growing up, a sister in her 20s with 3 kids and pregnant with a 4th, the sister's eldest son attacking the OP, and above all, them attempting to steal the OP's house by breaking in when he wasn't home. So many parts were nearly identical, right down to specific lines like "suck it up" and "my house is not up for grabs" being in the video. My parents and brother were understandably furious, and I wasn't pleased to see it either. We've all been working hard to move past our previous family dynamic and the chaos that ex-SIL put us through. You can imagine how much it took for me to let go of my grudges. But in the past year, my parents and Dan have made more progress than I had witnessed in my entire life before that. And I adore my nieces and nephews to bits. So, to whoever wrote that copycat story, congratulations. You've managed to send my entire family right back to needing therapy. And yes, my family is aware that I'm making this post. Now that I've gotten that rant out of the way, here's what I hope will be my final update. Regarding what I mentioned in the title, I had a few doubters before, but Dan kept his word. My camper was returned to me a few months ago, and it was in good condition. Dan took excellent care of it and gave it a thorough cleaning before handing it back. He and our father also took the time to reseal the roof while it was in their care. Inside, it's in just as good shape as when I was living in it. The only difference is that it now has a faint smell of pine cleaner. There was a bit of minor drama while Dan was living in my camper, involving a neighbor right behind them. I'm not entirely sure she qualifies as a Karen, but she was pretty close. She started yelling at them from over the fence about the camper and even threatened to call the police. My brother and father confronted her and explained that Dan was living in the camper so his son could have his own bedroom. Well, although the neighbor wasn't entirely satisfied, she did stop with the threats. Later, my father talked to her husband, who was extremely angry with her. He then apologized on her behalf and commended Dan for giving up his room for his son. The neighbor's husband also congratulated Dan on getting rid of XSIL, saying that he had always been hesitant to mention it before, but that she was truly a horrible woman. We can all agree on that now. So, thankfully, the neighbors aren't an issue anymore. Dan and our father managed to save up some money on the side and purchased a slightly larger camper to set up in our parents' backyard. We needed my truck to move it, but we managed to get it into place. It's the best option for Dan at the moment, considering the credit card debts his ex piled up still need to be paid off. And even after that, he has to plan for the future of his kids. He might be living in that camper for the next 10 years, but it's still preferable to how things were when he was married. His ex-wife certainly won't be contributing to the kids' college funds, except perhaps for her affair baby. Dan's camper is admittedly nicer than mine. It's newer, bigger, and has its own bathroom, whereas mine doesn't. Although, Dan hardly ever uses that bathroom. It's basically become a storage space since the toilet and shower are quite small. If he needs to use the restroom, he just goes inside the house. Dan and I had a good laugh about me supposedly being jealous that he has the better hobo house, and we joked and bantered about it like sarcastic gentlemen. He's outfitted his camper with some better amenities, like a flat-screen TV with streaming capabilities, video games, and a DVD player. He said it really feels like he has his own place now, even though it's just in the backyard. And he's much happier now that he's divorced. Dan told me that one day he hopes to get a truck of his own so that he can move the camper independently. But for now, he's sticking with his minivan for the sake of his kids. So, his camper is sitting comfortably where it is, and mine is back in my backyard where it belongs. It hasn't gone unused, though. I temporarily rented it to a cousin who moved to the area for work. They stayed in the camper for about a month before finding their own apartment. Other than that, it serves as a guest house when needed. Relatives come to use it when they're in town instead of having to book a motel. My nephew has also come over to stay in it a few times just for fun. His sisters don't seem to have much interest. For him and me, the camper is the closest we've come to experiencing camping. Sadly, I didn't buy it for camping purposes originally. I bought it to live in. As for my parents, they've been attending therapy. My mother has been prescribed medication for her mental health issues and fully acknowledges all the terrible mistakes she made as a parent in the past, particularly regarding the favoritism. My father is still a bit awkward around me, but he's been quite active in his church and is working hard to restore the family's reputation as best he can. And Dan has significantly cut back on his drinking since he's not as stressed as he used to be. He's even taken up exercising and is in pretty good shape now. He told me that his ex-wife saw a picture of him that he posted online after losing 20 pounds and called to compliment him. He didn't fall for her attempt to reel him back in, though. When it comes to the holidays, my parents, brother, and nieces and nephews all came to my Christmas Eve party last year, along with most of the other relatives who had attended the year before. There were no issues at all, except that none of them could stay the night in my spare rooms since I had rented them out. Both of my tenants were away visiting their own families at the time. Everything went smoothly. Not only was XSIL not invited, but she wouldn't have been able to crash the party even if she wanted to, thanks to the restraining order I have against her. And she's barely made any effort to spend time with her other kids either. She only bothered to see them twice a month at most, and didn't even send them gifts for Christmas or their birthdays since being exposed as a cheater. The kids were initially quite upset about it, but now they couldn't care less. XSIL seems to have decided that she's going to try to live as if she's single again, despite having a baby at home. And it hasn't gone well for her. Life has really given her a harsh wake-up call. On New Year's, XSIL went out late to party, and on her way home, she was pulled over by a police officer. She was arrested for driving under the influence, DUI, and her car was impounded. While she was being arrested, she called Dan, begging him to come get her car to prevent it from going to the impound lot. He told her that he wasn't going to help her and that she needed to deal with it on her own. Admittedly, Dan has driven while drunk in the past, so it was a bit hypocritical. But given all the pain this woman put him through, I don't blame him for turning her down. Some acquaintance of XSAL's, what we often call a flying monkey, called Dan to berate him and claim that he was a terrible person. I'm pretty sure it was the same woman who had called me previously. Dan wasn't having any of it and launched into a long rant about his ex-wife's cheating, what happened during the divorce, and how he has no sympathy for her since she left him with a mountain of credit card debt and has stopped doing anything for their kids. The flying monkey didn't call back after that. We still don't know who she was, but Dan said she sounded like a religious fanatic. XSIL went to court and pleaded guilty to the DUI charge. Dan found out about it because she called him, claiming that due to the DUI, she wouldn't be able to see her other kids for a while. She told him that she was sentenced to take a 6-month DUI class, during which time her license will be suspended until she completes it. And she's not allowed to drink at all, which is what she's most upset about. I've heard of these classes before. They require regular and sometimes random urine tests, and when you finally get your license back, you have to have a camera and a breathalyzer installed in your car for a year. Additionally, her insurance rates will increase because of the DUI on her record. XSIL is definitely not having a good time, but I have no pity for her. I've never driven while drunk. Sadly, that's all the information I have on XSIL. She's been keeping minimal contact with Dan for some time now, and eventually, she'll probably stop reaching out to him altogether unless it's absolutely necessary. I don't know anything else about SIL's parents or her affair baby. Even Dan is in the dark about those details. However, I do have a bit more information on someone else. Remember XSIL's affair partner, that smooth-talking guy? Well, he made his social media public again, and he seems to be completely ignoring the existence of XSIL and their child. Dan tried to message him, but he immediately blocked Dan. So, the guy is just being an ass and acting as if he has no responsibility. Whatever. His involvement with XSIL ultimately led to her being removed from our family. So in a way, we're all somewhat grateful to that jerk. That's everything I have to share, and hopefully, I won't need to come back here again. Unless, of course, my truck gets egged again next Halloween.